Maya Thompson had always loved the quiet hum of airplanes. There was something oddly comforting about the mechanical heartbeat beneath her feet, the gentle vibration that promised steady progress through the sky. Flight 227 was supposed to be like every other flight she'd taken over the years, predictable, uneventful, and smooth. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on as she walked down the narrow aisle, glancing at the other passengers with the detached curiosity of someone who had seen this scene hundreds of times. Tired businessmen slouched over laptops, parents wrestling toddlers into their seats, and elderly couples clinging to each other with quiet determination. Her window seat, 14C, was small, cramped, yet hers. She settled into it with the practiced ease of a seasoned traveler, feeling the subtle click of the seatbelt locking into place. Outside, the sky was a painting of oranges and purples, dusk wrapping the world in a deceptive calm. She could feel the cool draft of air conditioning flowing over her, the faint smell of recycled cabin air mixed with coffee and antiseptic cleaning sprays, a smell she had always associated with safety, routine, normalcy. As the plane taxied down the runway, Maya's thoughts wandered to her week ahead, the business meeting in New York, the reunion with her college friends, the quiet dinner she planned to enjoy alone once she reached her hotel. Flight 227 was a bridge, a mundane connector between points on a map, and like every bridge she had ever crossed, it was supposed to hold her safely until the other side came into view. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, pushing their carts and offering smiles that felt rehearsed but genuine. "Drinks?" one asked brightly, and Maya took a small bottle of water, nodding politely. She watched her fellow passengers, noticing small gestures, a young mother stroking her child's hair, a man nervously drumming his fingers on the tray table, a teenager scrolling endlessly through his phone. Each one seemed immersed in their own little world, cocooned in the illusion of normalcy. Then, as the plane reached cruising altitude, Maya felt a subtle shiver, not the comforting vibration of engines, but a sharp, almost imperceptible tremor that ran up through the floor beneath her feet. She glanced around, noting a few passengers raising eyebrows, but most didn't seem to notice. The overhead bins rattled slightly, a quiet metallic echo that made her pulse quicken. She swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the feeling. It was probably just turbulence, or maybe nothing at all. Planes shuddered sometimes, it was normal. But inside the cockpit, a different story was unfolding. A faint alarm had begun to beep, so quiet that it was almost drowned out by the roar of the engines, yet persistent enough to set the pilot's teeth on edge. The co-pilot's brow furrowed as he scanned the instrument panel. A minor mechanical fault, nothing catastrophic yet. He exchanged a quick glance with the captain, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We'll monitor it," the captain murmured, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed a hint of unease. Maya, oblivious to the technical warning flashing in the cockpit, let her eyes wander to the horizon. The city lights far below were tiny pinpoints, sparkling like stars scattered across the earth. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window and let herself get lost in the view. The world seemed peaceful from up here, suspended above the chaos of daily life. Nothing could touch them, or so she thought. Then the plane shuddered again, slightly more pronounced this time. Drinks jostled in trays, a few passengers instinctively gripped armrests. Maya's stomach fluttered, a nervous tick she hadn't felt in years. Her heartbeat seemed louder than normal, the hum of the engine suddenly intrusive. She tightened her seatbelt and looked around. A man across the aisle gave her a nervous smile, attempting to make a joke. "Looks like a bumpy ride," he said, but his laughter faltered halfway. The overhead lights flickered. A faint smell of burnt plastic reached her nose. Maya frowned, glancing up at the ceiling as she caught a glimpse of a tiny wisp of smoke curling from one of the vents near the cockpit. She blinked rapidly, questioning her senses. Maybe it was the reflection of the sun setting, or maybe, just maybe, something wasn't right. Her eyes darted to the flight attendants who were finishing their beverage service. She noticed one exchange a quick, almost imperceptible glance with a colleague, a flash of concern passing between them. Their smiles remained, but there was tension beneath the surface, a rhythm of anxiety hidden beneath professional calm. Maya felt a shiver run down her spine, a premonition she couldn't explain. The plane hummed steadily again, reassuringly, or so it seemed. Maya exhaled, leaning back into her seat, trying to convince herself it was all in her head. Outside, the sky darkened, deep purples giving way to a creeping darkness that swallowed the horizon. Lights twinkled far below, and she found herself thinking how tiny and insignificant the problems of daily life felt from this height. Then it happened. A sharper jolt ran through the fuselage, stronger than before. Passengers yelped, drinks spilled, luggage shifted in the overhead bins. Maya's heart leapt into her throat. She gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. The plane tilted slightly, and she could feel the unsettling sensation of weightlessness as it righted itself. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Maya's fingers trembled as she rechecked her seatbelt. Minor turbulence. It didn't feel minor. The plane shuddered again, sharper this time, rattling the trays and shaking the passengers in their seats. A young boy across the aisle began to cry, and the mother shushed him, her voice trembling. Maya's pulse raced. Something wasn't right. She could feel it, a gnawing sense in her gut that this flight was no longer routine. She glanced at the window again. The sky was dark now, almost black, save for the tiny glimmer of city lights far below. The plane's shadowed silhouette cut through the clouds, alone in the night, and the vast emptiness outside amplified every small noise within. A faint, metallic pop echoed from somewhere in the cabin. Maya froze, listening. Passengers murmured, exchanging nervous glances. The flight attendants paused mid-step, their professional smiles faltering. And somewhere up front, beyond the closed cockpit door, an alarm beeped, a warning light flashing red, signaling a problem that would soon spiral out of control. Maya gripped her armrests, heart hammering in her chest. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air seemed thick, electric with tension. What had started as a routine flight was no longer routine. Something had begun deep in the plane's systems, something invisible, deadly, and unstoppable. And in that moment, Maya had no idea that Flight 227 was about to test every ounce of her courage, every instinct she didn't know she possessed. Maya's fingers were still locked around her armrests, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her breathing. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. A few passengers screamed involuntarily, the sound echoing through the narrow fuselage. Drinks spilled over tray tables, their sticky liquid pooling on the carpet, mingling with the faint smell of burnt plastic that seemed to hang in the air like a warning. The overhead bins rattled ominously, a subtle metallic clatter that made everyone look up instinctively. Even the normally composed flight attendants exchanged tense glances, their smiles strained. "Please remain calm, everyone," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, just loud enough to be heard over the alarmed murmurs and the growing rumble of the engines. It was firm, but there was an edge to it, a tension that betrayed worry. Maya's heart sank. The calm voice was supposed to be reassuring, but tonight it felt like a fragile thread holding together a collapsing reality. Across the aisle, a man in his mid-30s gripped his armrests, pale and wide-eyed. A child beside him whimpered quietly, pressing her face against her mother's shoulder. Maya's gaze shifted to the young mother. Her eyes darted to the ceiling, to the windows, to the passengers around her. Everyone seemed to sense on some level that this wasn't ordinary turbulence. Fear was contagious. It moved like an invisible current, threading through the cabin, wrapping everyone in icy apprehension. Then came the smell again, stronger now, sharp and acrid, almost chemical. Maya's nose burned as she glanced toward the vents above. Smoke curled lazily from the cockpit ceiling, thin and almost invisible at first, but growing in intensity. Panic began to spread. A few passengers started praying silently, eyes squeezed shut. Others whispered frantic reassurances to children who didn't understand, their trembling hands gripping tiny wrists. Maya felt her own stomach twist. Something had gone wrong, but she couldn't see it yet. The plane tilted sharply to the left, sending drinks and personal belongings sliding across the cabin floor. Maya's stomach lurched violently. She barely had time to brace herself against the seatbelt before the plane righted itself with a bone-rattling thud. Around her, passengers gasped, clutching whatever they could. The flight attendants rushed to reassure them, but their faces betrayed fear. A young flight attendant whispered something to a colleague and then quickly returned to serving, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Through the noise, Maya thought she heard the faintest crackle from the cockpit intercom, a voice too low for clarity but sharp, urgent. It was gone before anyone could focus on it, leaving only the static hum and the growing roar of engines. She tried to steady her racing thoughts. "It's turbulence," she whispered to herself. "Just turbulence." But the tremor running through the plane felt different, unnatural. Her mind refused to accept it, and yet, deep down, she knew the truth. This flight had already started to spiral out of control. Suddenly the plane lurched again, violently this time, throwing passengers forward in their seats. Screams erupted, and oxygen masks dropped from above, swinging slightly as the cabin filled with the hiss of released oxygen. Maya fumbled to secure her own mask over her face, heart hammering in panic. Around her, chaos consumed the aisle. Passengers clutched their loved ones, some trembling, others frozen in disbelief. The small child across from her cried uncontrollably, pulling at her mother's sleeve, while an elderly man muttered prayers under his breath, voice breaking. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, steadier this time but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm. We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Maya could feel her chest tighten. The words were meant to reassure, yet they made the situation feel even more urgent. Technical difficulties. Something mechanical, something invisible, threatening their survival, and the calm tone only magnified the terror. Her gaze drifted to the cockpit door, a solid barrier of steel and mystery. Sparks flickered near the top hinge of the door frame, unnoticed by most but not by Maya. She swallowed hard. Smoke began to rise more aggressively, curling toward the cabin like dark tendrils. The smell of burning plastic grew stronger, acrid and bitter. Maya's fingers gripped the armrest so tightly it ached. Around her, passengers began to murmur, a rising tide of anxiety that pulsed through the cabin. A young man nearby pressed his phone to the intercom, trying to reach the pilots. "Someone help us," he shouted. But there was no response beyond the strained calmness of the captain's voice and the growing alarms. The plane shook violently, throwing Maya forward. She closed her eyes, clutching her mask, wishing desperately she could disappear, wished the floor would swallow her whole. Then she noticed him, the man walking calmly down the aisle despite the chaos. He wore a pilot's uniform, though she didn't recognize the airline insignia. Something in his presence demanded attention, commanded belief. He moved quickly, helping a flight attendant secure a fallen tray and comforting a passenger clutching a child. He was calm, controlled, yet the fear in his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. He glanced toward the cockpit, muttering something under his breath. Maya couldn't hear the words, but she sensed their urgency. The plane tilted again, sharper than before. Drinks spilled, luggage tumbled, and a deafening metallic pop echoed through the fuselage. The cabin erupted into screams. Maya's stomach felt like it had dropped from thousands of feet. She felt the pull of gravity shift, her mask fogging slightly as she gasped for air. Panic rippled through the cabin, swelling louder with every moment. The flight attendants struggled to maintain composure, holding onto carts and straps to steady themselves. Maya's eyes darted to the strangers around her. Businessmen, mothers, children, elderly couples, all thrown into a shared nightmare. Some clutched their seats, some prayed, some whispered frantic reassurances. She realized in a sudden, sharp clarity that no one was prepared for this. They were passengers in an aircraft that had become a living entity, unpredictable and dangerous. Fear was contagious, but survival instincts were starting to surface in strange, unexpected ways. The pilot's voice returned over the intercom, but now it was clipped tense. "We're losing altitude. Please remain calm. Keep your seatbelts fastened." Maya's pulse raced uncontrollably. Losing altitude, Not just turbulence, not just mechanical noise, actual altitude dropping too quickly for comfort. She glanced out the window. Darkness stretched endlessly below, the faint glimmer of lights from cities now distant, unreachable, like a world receding into shadow. A passenger in the row behind her gasped, gripping the seat in front of him. The plane shuddered again, violently, and a section of the overhead compartment popped open. Bags spilled onto the aisle, narrowly missing people below. Screams erupted anew. Maya's heart raced, throat dry. The seatbelt sign above her flickered and blinked, a frantic signal she could no longer ignore. Then she saw him again, the pilot in uniform. He paused in the aisle, eyes scanning the cabin. He seemed to search for someone. When his gaze locked with hers, Maya felt a sudden, inexplicable pull, as if fate itself had singled her out. There was urgency in his eyes, a plea, a silent command, something beyond explanation. And in that moment, Maya realized that this flight was no longer just a journey from one city to another. Something critical had gone wrong, something terrifying, something that would demand more courage than she had ever known she possessed. The hum of Flight 227 had once been a comforting lull, a steady heartbeat beneath her feet. Now, it was a relentless roar, a mechanical growl that seemed to reverberate through every bone in Maya Thompson's body. The plane lurched violently, throwing passengers forward as if the cabin were a tiny vessel tossed in a stormy sea. Oxygen masks dangled like ghostly pendants above each seat, swinging violently as the rush of air carried the faint scent of burnt plastic and fear. Maya's fingers dug into the armrests as her stomach tried to escape through her throat. Passengers screamed, some of them clinging to each other, eyes wide with terror. Drinks spilled across laps, luggage toppled from overhead bins, and the faint hum of electronics mixed with the metallic groan of the fuselage. The captain's calm voice had vanished, replaced by the sharp, clipped communication of urgency over the intercom. Brace! 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 But words felt meaningless in the maelstrom of the cabin. Maya gritted her teeth, pressing her face into the seatbelt strap, wishing desperately that she could vanish. A sharp jolt sent the plane tilting sideways, causing a chain reaction of chaos. Passengers collided with tray tables and overhead compartments, groaning as they were thrown against hard surfaces. A mother screamed as her child's stroller tipped over, a wave of panic rippling through her rows. Flight attendants clutched carts and rails, attempting to keep balance, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The emergency lights flickered violently, casting long, shifting shadows across the panicked faces of everyone on board. Maya's eyes darted to the cockpit door. Sparks had begun to flicker along the frame, curling like tiny serpents in the smoke-filled air. She could barely make out the co-pilot's silhouette behind the small window, moving frantically, hands gesturing over instruments she could not see. Something had clearly failed, a critical system that could not be ignored. Panic surged through Maya like electricity. She realized, with a cold clarity, that they were no longer passengers. They were trapped in a machine with a mind of its own, plummeting through the sky at an impossible angle. The plane lurched again violently, and Maya's oxygen mask fogged with her rapid breathing. Her eyes scanned the cabin, taking in every desperate gesture. A young man praying with lips pressed tight, an elderly couple clutching hands so hard their knuckles had gone white, children crying, their terrified voices echoing in the small, twisting fuselage. The air was thick with a mix of fear, smoke, and unspoken dread. It was suffocating, yet somehow the passengers could not look away from each other. Their shared terror was a strange tether, binding them together in a moment suspended between life and death. And then she saw him, the off-duty pilot. He had appeared from the rear of the plane, moving with unnatural precision through the chaos. His uniform was smudged with soot, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, yet his movements were purposeful. He helped a flight attendant right a fallen drink cart, pulled a child to safety, and reassured a passenger who had collapsed against the bulkhead. He was calm in a storm where calm was impossible, but the fear in his eyes told Maya what she had already begun to suspect. The situation was far worse than anyone on the plane realized. He approached the cockpit door, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the controls of a panel she could not see. A sudden flash of sparks illuminated his face, and Maya noticed the strain etched deep into his jaw. His voice rose above the roar of the engines, commanding, urgent. "I need a volunteer, someone willing to help, or we're not going to make it." His gaze swept the cabin, stopping on Maya as if destiny itself had singled her out. Maya's heart stopped. She was just a passenger, untrained, unprepared, utterly ordinary. Yet in that instant she felt an unexplainable pull toward the cockpit. Something told her that standing still, doing nothing, was not an option. Around her, the plane continued to shudder, violently tilting from side to side. Sparks fell from overhead bins, hitting the floor with sizzling cracks. Smoke coiled through the cabin, and passengers began coughing violently, some pressing damp cloths to their mouths in desperation. She glanced at her fellow passengers. Some were paralyzed by fear, frozen in their seats. Others were screaming for loved ones, praying or clinging to hope. Maya could feel the raw, desperate energy of survival spreading through the cabin like wildfire. The off-duty pilot's gaze returned to her, steady now, commanding. "You have to help. We don't have time to explain. I'll guide you." The plane shuddered again, violently enough to toss her into the side of the seat. Oxygen masks swung wildly above like pendulums of doom. The metallic groan of the fuselage vibrated through her bones. She clutched the seatbelt and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The cabin smelled of burnt circuitry and fear. Sweat poured down her face, dripping into her eyes, stinging her vision. A loud pop rang through the fuselage, echoing in a way that made the plane feel impossibly fragile. The lights flickered, and smoke began curling thicker from the cockpit. Passengers screamed in panic, many clutching their seats for dear life. Maya's stomach twisted violently as the plane tilted dangerously toward the right. The city lights below were distant and unhelpful, mere pinpoints swallowed by the night. The off-duty pilot turned to her, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You can do this. I'll guide you. If we don't act now," he didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear. There would be no later, no opportunity to correct mistakes once the plane's systems failed entirely. Maya's hands trembled as she took in the situation. Ordinary instinct screamed at her to stay in her seat, hide, survive passively. But a deeper, almost primal urge compelled her to move forward, toward the cockpit, toward the unknown. The plane tilted sharply again, violently, and Maya was thrown into the aisle, her knees hitting the floor. She scrambled upright, fumbling for her backpack as if it might offer protection. Around her, chaos reigned supreme. Passengers screamed, luggage spilled, and the metallic groan of the fuselage intensified. Sparks flew from the overhead panels, and a thin wisp of smoke rose ominously, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. Then she saw it, the cockpit window, illuminated briefly by flickering lights inside. She could make out the co-pilot's silhouette, hands moving frantically over the controls. Sparks flickered near the instruments. The plane tilted again, violently, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. Maya's pulse raced uncontrollably, fear threatening to overwhelm her senses. And yet in the midst of this chaos, the off-duty pilot's voice remained a lifeline. Calm, commanding, human. "You're the only one who can help now," he shouted over the roar, his eyes locking onto hers. "Step up or we lose this plane." Maya froze for a heartbeat, heart hammering in her chest. She was untrained, unprepared, terrified. Yet something in that moment crystallized within her. She would not survive by waiting. She would not survive by hiding. Flight 227 was demanding courage she had never known she possessed. As the plane lurched violently again, tipping downward at a dangerous angle, Maya realized the unthinkable truth. Her ordinary life had just ended. Her extraordinary test had begun. The roar of Flight 227 was deafening, a relentless force that shook the plane from nose to tail. Maya Thompson's heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing her terror. Around her, the cabin was a storm of chaos. Passengers gripping seatbacks, children wailing, and luggage sliding across the aisles. Sparks fell from overhead compartments, hitting the floor with sizzling cracks that made the walls feel alive with danger. The smell of burning plastic grew stronger, filling every corner with the acrid stench of impending disaster. Amid the chaos, he appeared, the man in the pilot's uniform, moving with an almost unnatural calm. Maya could see the faint reflection of flickering lights in his eyes, a storm behind his steady gaze. He was not part of the official crew. She had noticed his badge glinting earlier, the insignia unfamiliar. Yet there he was, navigating the panicked cabin like a conductor guiding a symphony of fear. He knelt beside a young mother and her child, securing the little girl into her mother's lap, whispering instructions that Maya couldn't hear but sensed carried life-saving weight. He moved to another aisle, helping a man who had stumbled, offering a hand but not stopping to pause himself. Sparks flew closer, curling upward from the ceiling, yet he did not flinch. Maya watched, transfixed. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but beneath it lay a fierce determination, a sense that he had done this before or had trained himself to do the impossible. She felt a jolt of hope that someone, anyone, could wrest control from the chaos. The plane lurched violently, tilting sharply to the left. Passengers screamed, flailing as gravity shifted beneath them. Oxygen masks swung overhead like ghostly pendants, and Maya's stomach lurched in tandem with the tilt. She pressed herself into the seat, clutching the armrests until her knuckles whitened. Sparks flickered from the cockpit door. The man in uniform paused there, glancing at the panel inside. He muttered a single word, low, urgent, almost drowned by the roar of engines, but it carried a weight Maya couldn't ignore. His eyes found hers, and in that gaze Maya felt the weight of an unspoken demand. "You," he mouthed silently, "you can help." The words, or rather the meaning behind them, struck her like a bolt of lightning. She was terrified, she was untrained. She had no idea how to control a plane, yet staring into his eyes she realized something that made her stomach twist with equal parts fear and resolve. There was no one else. No one else could step in, not the passengers, not the frightened flight attendants, not even the official pilots who were struggling behind that cockpit door. It was her. The plane tilted again, violently enough to throw a tray table across the aisle. A young boy screamed, clinging to his mother, and a man fell sideways, crashing against the wall of the fuselage. The off-duty pilot moved like a lifeline through the storm, shouting instructions, grabbing hands, steadying bodies. He reached Maya, grabbed her arm, and yelled over the roar, "You have to come. Now." Her mind screamed at her to resist. Ordinary instinct urged her to stay seated, to hide, to survive passively. But something deeper, primal, urgent, impossible to ignore, pushed her forward. She nodded shakily, and the man gave a barely perceptible smile before gesturing toward the cockpit. Smoke curled around them. Sparks dropped perilously close, and the plane lurched once more, tipping at an angle that made Maya feel as though she were falling through the sky. Each step toward the cockpit felt like moving through a nightmare. Luggage tumbled past her, passengers cried out, and the acrid smell of smoke burned her lungs. She pressed against the seats and rails, inching forward, the off-duty pilot guiding her through the chaos. Every sense screamed danger, every instinct begged her to stop, yet she moved. Forward, forward, forward. As she reached the cockpit, the door was ajar, flickering with sparks and smoke curling out like the breath of a beast. She could make out two figures inside. The captain and co-pilot, their hands flying over the controls, faces tight with concentration and fear. The alarms blared like sirens in her ears. Sparks leapt from panels, tiny eruptions of fire that hissed when they hit the metal floor. The off-duty pilot leaned close, whispering urgently, "I'll guide you. Follow my lead. You're the only chance we have." His hand rested briefly on her shoulder, grounding her amidst the chaos. Maya's chest heaved as she nodded, swallowing bile, trying to steady her shaking hands. She reached for the cockpit door handle, cold and metallic beneath her fingers. Smoke swirled around her, thick enough that she could barely see. The plane tilted again, violently, and she had to brace herself against the frame to avoid being thrown back into the cabin. Inside the cockpit, the captain glanced at her, eyes widening in surprise. He didn't speak, he couldn't. The alarms, the tilt, the failing systems demanded every ounce of his attention. But he didn't stop her either. Something in her face, in her hesitation mixed with resolve, told him she might just be the only chance to regain control. The off-duty pilot motioned toward the controls. "Here," he shouted. "Do exactly as I say, you can do this." Maya's hands hovered over the unknown instruments. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Sweat stung her eyes and her vision blurred from fear. Yet as she glanced back at the cabin, she saw the desperate faces of the passengers, children clinging to mothers, families praying silently, elderly couples gripping each other like anchors. Lives depended on her. Her fingers finally closed around the throttle, shaking violently. The off-duty pilot leaned in, shouting instructions, guiding her through each movement with precision. Sparks crackled nearby, smoke curling around her like a living thing, but she focused on the instruments. The plane lurched again, violently, throwing her against the side. She gritted her teeth, forcing her body to obey, forcing her fear into sharp focus. Minutes, or was it seconds, stretched into eternity. The plane's nose dipped dangerously, then righted slightly. Every adjustment felt impossible, but under the off-duty pilot's calm guidance, Maya began to mimic his movements. The plane shuddered violently again, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of control, a fragile thread of hope in the storm. And then a new, horrifying alarm blared, a warning she hadn't noticed before. Red lights flashed furiously across the console. The plane lurched again, violently enough to throw passengers forward even while belted in. Sparks erupted near the overhead panel, smoke spiraled like black ribbons, and the roar of the engines became a deafening wave of sound. Maya's chest tightened. She realized in that instant that they were not just fighting turbulence or mechanical failure. They were fighting a catastrophe that could end every life aboard Flight 227. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. And as she gripped the controls, smoke curling around her face and sparks falling dangerously close, Maya understood the terrifying truth. She was no longer just a passenger. She was Flight 227's only hope. Maya's hands hovered over the cockpit controls, cold and trembling. Every fiber of her body screamed to retreat, to step back into the safety of her seat in the cabin. But the faces of the passengers, the children clutching their mothers, the elderly couple grasping each other's hands, the young mother whispering prayers, pulled her forward. The off-duty pilot's gaze was steady, unwavering, locking onto hers with the intensity of someone who knew there was no second chance. "You have to do it," he shouted over the roar of the engines and the alarms. "There's no one else. We can't make it without you." Her mind raced. She had no training, no knowledge of these instruments, no understanding of aerodynamics. Flight simulators had never prepared her for this. Never in her wildest nightmares had she imagined herself here, hands on a plane teetering on the edge of disaster. Yet there was no time to hesitate. Every second counted. Maya took a trembling breath and gripped the throttle. The metal was cold, unforgiving, and she could feel the vibrations from the engines reverberating through her hands. She glanced at the off-duty pilot, who pointed to a series of levers and buttons, shouting clear instructions over the alarms. Her pulse throbbed in her temples as she followed each command, fumbling and shaking, but following nonetheless. The plane lurched violently, tilting sharply to the left. Maya's stomach dropped. She pressed her weight into the controls, mimicking the movements she had seen him perform. Sparks rained from an overhead panel and smoke coiled around the cockpit like living tendrils. The plane groaned under the strain, metal twisting in protest. Behind her, passengers screamed, some sobbing, some praying, as the plane's movements became increasingly erratic. "You're doing it," the pilot shouted, his voice fierce and urgent. "Keep it steady, don't panic." Maya's fingers ached, her arms trembling as she tried to adjust the throttle and control stick. She glanced at the altitude indicator, dropping fast. The ground below was a blur of city lights, small and distant, mocking her helplessness. Sparks erupted from another panel and the acrid smell of smoke burned her lungs. Panic threatened to overtake her, but she forced herself to breathe, focusing only on the instructions. One step at a time. One movement at a time. A sudden jolt threw her against the side of the cockpit. She gasped, heart hammering, but the off-duty pilot grabbed her shoulder, steadying her. "Focus. You can do this," he said, voice calm but edged with urgency. "We don't have time for fear." The plane tilted again, violently, and Maya pressed her weight into the control stick. She could feel the plane responding slowly, imperceptibly to her movements. The slightest adjustment caused a ripple of relief in her chest, a fragile thread of hope. The off-duty pilot nodded, approving the corrections, but there was no time to celebrate. Another alarm blared, red lights flashing across the console. Smoke thickened, curling around her head and searing her eyes. Suddenly, a loud pop echoed from the fuselage, a metallic snap that made her heart leap into her throat. Sparks flew from the overhead panel, falling dangerously close to her hands. The plane lurched again, violently, and Maya felt herself lifted slightly from the seat as gravity shifted with terrifying unpredictability. She pressed herself into the controls, biting back a scream as the cabin below rattled with chaos. "You're the only one who can save this flight," the off-duty pilot shouted. "Do exactly what I say." Maya's mind narrowed to the instruments in front of her, levers, buttons, and screens that seemed alien yet essential. Her hands moved, shaking violently, but she followed every command. The plane's nose dipped dangerously, then rose slightly under her guidance. Every tiny movement mattered. Every decision carried the weight of life and death. Around her, the alarms continued to wail, the engines roared, and sparks continued to fly. She glanced back briefly at the cabin. Passengers were gripping their seatbelts, eyes wide, some staring at her through the small cockpit window. She realized in that moment the gravity of her choice. This was no longer just about survival. It was about responsibility, controlling a machine capable of death, carrying 180 souls in the sky, relying on her hands, her instincts, her courage. Another tilt threw her against the controls. She gasped for breath, sweat stinging her eyes. The plane groaned under the strain. Sparks sizzled dangerously close to the control panel. Smoke thickened, curling like black ribbons that obscured her vision. Yet amidst the chaos, she continued to follow instructions, every movement deliberate, every breath calculated. The off-duty pilot leaned close, shouting, "Keep it steady. Adjust the throttle, pull up slightly. You're doing it." Her arms shook violently as she mimicked his movements. The plane responded slowly, imperceptibly. The first glimmer of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could stabilize the aircraft long enough to survive. Then another warning light blared, a bright red indicator flashing furiously. The plane lurched violently again, tipping at an angle that made Maya's stomach twist. Sparks erupted nearby and the cabin below rocked violently. She gritted her teeth, forcing her hands to move with precision despite the chaos. The off-duty pilot's voice remained her anchor, calm yet commanding. "One more adjustment. You can do this." Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every muscle in her body screamed with exhaustion. Her fingers were numb, arms trembling, yet she pressed on. Slowly, impossibly, the plane began to stabilize. The violent tilts became less extreme, the roar of the engine seemed to settle slightly, and the cabin below rocked less violently. Maya's pulse raced, but a fragile thread of hope had taken root. Her eyes met the off-duty pilot's. There was a brief, silent acknowledgement, a recognition that she had taken the first step from fear to action, from panic to control. The plane was not safe yet, far from it, but for the first time since the chaos began, it was responding to human guidance, responding to her. But there was no time to relax. Another alarm shrieked from the console, red lights flashing across the cockpit. The plane lurched again, and Maya realized with a sinking feeling that the real challenge, the critical test of skill and courage, was only just beginning. And as sparks fell around her and smoke curled through the cockpit, Maya understood the terrifying truth. Flight 227 was far from secure, and her impossible choice had only pulled her deeper into the fight for survival. Maya's arms ached, trembling with exertion, but she refused to let go of the controls. The cockpit was a storm of alarms, smoke, and sparks, each element vying for her attention and threatening to overwhelm her senses. The acrid smell of burning circuitry burned her lungs, but she forced herself to focus. Every movement of her hands mattered. Every decision carried the weight of 180 lives, the lives of strangers who had become inexplicably connected to her in this suspended nightmare. The plane lurched violently again, tipping sharply to the right. Passengers screamed, their voices blending into a horrifying chorus that echoed through the fuselage. Bags tumbled from overhead compartments, some hitting the floor with a deafening crash. Maya's stomach dropped in tandem with the plane's nose, the sudden freefall sensation making her heart hammer in her chest. The off-duty pilot leaned close, shouting precise instructions through the roar of the engines. Throttle up slowly, correct the tilt, watch the altitude. Maya's fingers moved over the controls, numb and trembling, following his guidance with desperate precision. Sparks sizzled from a panel above, falling onto the console, and she flinched, but she didn't let go. Each small adjustment brought a fraction of stability, but the plane was far from safe. It shuddered violently with every correction, metal groaning under the stress. She glanced at the cabin through the small cockpit window. Panic had escalated into chaos. Passengers were bracing against seats and walls, children screaming and flight attendants struggling to calm the crowd. Yet, despite the fear, there was a glimmer of hope. Her actions were making a difference. The plane was responding slowly, imperfectly, but it was responding. Maya's chest tightened with the realization that she was no longer merely a passenger. She was the fragile thread holding the aircraft and its occupants together. Suddenly, a sharp jolt sent her against the control stick. Sparks erupted from the overhead panel again, dangerously close to her hands. Smoke thickened, obscuring her vision, curling like dark ribbons. The plane tilted sharply downward and Maya gasped, her heart in her throat. Around her, the cabin below shook violently, the passengers' cries blending with the mechanical roar of the engines. She felt a wave of vertigo, nausea, and fear, but she forced herself to steady her hands. "You can do this," the off-duty pilot shouted, his voice steady amid chaos. "Keep it level, one adjustment at a time." Maya's hands moved with trembling precision, each motion deliberate. The plane responded slightly, the violent tilts lessening, though the alarms continued to scream. Sparks fell dangerously close and she ducked instinctively, coughing as smoke stung her eyes. Her muscles screamed with fatigue, but she pushed onward, refusing to let fear dominate. Every second counted. Every action mattered. Another sudden jolt threw her against the side of the cockpit. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay upright, hands clinging to the controls as the plane tilted and shook violently. Through the haze of smoke, she could see the off-duty pilot's face, calm but etched with worry. "Adjust the rudder, pull up, you're almost there." Her pulse raced as she followed his instructions. Slowly, imperceptibly, the plane began to respond. The violent side-to-side tilts became less extreme, though the alarms continued to scream. Sparks sizzled around her, but she felt a flicker of control. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was actively guiding the plane, keeping it from spiraling further into disaster. Maya's gaze drifted to the altitude gauge. They were still losing height rapidly, dangerously, but there was a trend, slight, fragile, but real. Every tiny movement of the controls was making a difference. The plane's nose steadied just a fraction, yet enough to spark hope. Then another warning light flared red, bright and alarming. A hiss of escaping smoke followed as another panel short-circuited. The plane lurched violently again, forcing her to press her body against the controls to maintain balance. She coughed, eyes watering, hands shaking. The cabin below rocked violently, passengers crying and praying, some clinging to each other, some whispering frantic instructions to terrified children. The off-duty pilot's hand rested on her shoulder briefly, steadying her. "You've got this," he shouted, voice cutting through the chaos. One more adjustment, pull up slowly, keep the tilt balanced. Maya swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. Sweat dripped down her forehead, blurring her vision. Her arms burned, muscles trembling from exertion, but she refused to let go. She pulled the throttle gently, adjusting the stick with trembling precision. The plane responded slowly, its violent motions decreasing slightly. Sparks sizzled harmlessly past her, smoke curling thickly around her head, but she kept going. Minutes stretched into eternity. Each second felt like a lifetime as she followed instructions, adjusting, correcting, fighting to keep the plane steady. She could feel the fragility of their situation with every movement. One wrong adjustment, one missed signal, and the plane could spiral further into catastrophe. Yet, despite the terror, she refused to give in. Then came the moment she realized they were gaining marginal control. The violent dips lessened, the tilts were less extreme, and the plane, incredibly, began to respond consistently to her guidance. The passengers' cries below shifted from sheer panic to cautious hope. She could see flight attendants bracing themselves, trying to reassure those around them. Children's sobs grew quieter, replaced by whispers of prayers and gratitude. Her chest heaved, lungs burning, but she forced herself to continue. Sparks fell, alarms blared, and smoke thickened, but she focused on the small, critical adjustments that were keeping Flight 227 from plummeting further. The off-duty pilot's voice remained a constant guide, calm yet commanding, his presence anchoring her in a storm of chaos. And then another sudden jolt, a violent tilt that made her stomach lurch, reminded her how close they were to disaster. Sparks erupted dangerously near her hands. The plane groaned, metal twisting in protest. Maya's pulse thundered, fear clawing at her every nerve. She had stabilized the plane marginally, but the fight was far from over. Every second remained a test of endurance, skill, and courage. She glanced back at the cabin, at the terrified passengers depending on her. Every life on Flight 227 hung in the balance. She realized in that instant the terrifying truth. They were not merely surviving turbulence or a mechanical failure. They were facing a near-impossible battle for life, and she was now at the center of it. And as sparks flew and smoke curled thickly around her, Maya understood something chilling. The fight to survive had only just begun. Maya's hands burned as she clutched the controls, muscles trembling, sweat stinging her eyes. The cockpit was a maelstrom. Alarms blared incessantly, smoke curled thickly like dark ribbons around her head, and sparks sizzled dangerously close to the instruments. The acrid scent of burning circuitry filled the cabin, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. The plane lurched violently, tilting sharply to the left, throwing her stomach into her throat. Each tilt, each shift of the aircraft, carried the weight of countless lives. Passengers below screamed, their cries blending into a chaotic symphony of terror. Children cried, mothers clutched them desperately, and the elderly whispered prayers under their breath. Flight attendants shouted instructions and reassurances, voices tight with fear. Maya's pulse thundered as she glanced briefly at the cabin through the cockpit window. Each terrified face, each anxious movement, reminded her of what was at stake. "You're almost there," the off-duty pilot shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the engines. "Keep it steady, one final adjustment." Maya's fingers shook as she followed his guidance, moving the throttle and stick with trembling precision. The plane groaned under the strain, metal twisting as it fought against gravity. Sparks popped from the overhead panel, smoke curling thickly around her. She felt the heat on her face, felt the vibration of the failing engines beneath her. Every sense screamed danger, yet she refused to relent. The altitude indicator blinked urgently, still dropping but slowly, controllably. Each adjustment brought the plane back from the brink, though just barely. The off-duty pilot leaned in close, shouting instructions rapidly. "Pull up slowly, adjust the rudder, don't overcorrect." Maya's hands obeyed, her body straining against exhaustion and fear. The plane responded, imperceptibly at first, then more steadily. The violent tilts lessened, replaced by a fragile balance. Sparks continued to fly and smoke thickened, curling in her peripheral vision, but she pressed on, every movement deliberate, every breath calculated. She glanced back at the cabin. Passengers were bracing against seats, holding on to loved ones, their wide eyes filled with terror and hope. The young mother with her child clutched them tighter. The elderly couple gripped each other, praying. Every life depended on her, and the thought sent a shiver down her spine. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to focus, to act, to survive. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently to the right, throwing her forward. Sparks erupted near the throttle and smoke coiled dangerously close to her hands. Maya bit back a scream, pressing herself into the controls, forcing her shaking muscles to obey. The off-duty pilot's voice rose above the chaos. "You can do this. Pull up slowly. Steady now." Maya's hands moved with trembling precision. The plane responded, gradually stabilizing. The violent tilts became less extreme, though the alarms continued to scream. The cabin below rocked violently but had not yet descended into complete chaos. Passengers clutched their seatbelts, eyes wide, praying, hopping. Her pulse raced uncontrollably as she focused on the instruments. The altitude was still dangerously low, but the plane's trajectory had shifted upward. Tiny adjustments, delicate movements were holding Flight 227 in a precarious balance. Sweat poured down her face, blurring her vision, but she refused to let it distract her. Every second mattered. Every movement could mean life or death. "You're doing it," the off-duty pilot shouted. "Just a little more, keep it steady, you've got this." Maya pressed the throttle gently, adjusted the stick slightly, and felt a flicker of control. The plane responded. The violent side-to-side tilts lessened. Sparks popped harmlessly past her, smoke coiled around her head, but the instruments showed gradual improvement. They were gaining control, fragile, imperfect, but real. Another jolt rocked the plane violently, but Maya maintained her focus. Her hands moved rapidly, adjusting the rudder, correcting the tilt, pulling up slightly. The plane groaned but obeyed. The off-duty pilot's voice guided her through every movement. Minutes, or was it seconds, stretched into eternity. The struggle for control consumed every ounce of her strength, every shred of courage. She glanced at the cabin again. The passengers were still terrified, but hope was flickering. Children clung to parents, flight attendants braced themselves, and the elderly whispered prayers. Maya realized in a flash of clarity that her actions were directly saving lives. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, but it also steeled her resolve. She would not fail. Then came the moment of truth. The plane had stabilized marginally, enough to allow for a controlled descent. The violent tilts were gone, replaced by a shaky but steady trajectory. Sparks still flew, smoke still curled, but Flight 227 was no longer plummeting uncontrollably. Maya's chest heaved, muscles trembling, sweat pouring, yet a fragile thread of relief began to emerge. The off-duty pilot leaned close, shouting over the alarms. "You've done it. Now bring her down gently, steady descent, slow and controlled." Maya's hands moved with precision, guided by the pilot's voice. She adjusted the throttle, guided the stick, and felt the plane respond. The altitude slowly decreased, the ground approaching, and the violent chaos began to subside. Sparks continued to fall, smoke lingered, but the plane was alive, still intact, and obeying her guidance. Minutes stretched on as she executed the controlled descent. Every muscle burned, every nerve strained, but she refused to stop. The plane responded to her movements, every tiny adjustment holding the fragile thread of survival. The cabin below rocked slightly, passengers bracing themselves, eyes wide, holding onto hope. Finally, as the runway lights appeared in the distance, Maya felt a flicker of triumph. The plane was under control, still fragile but alive. The off-duty pilot's voice rose in relief and encouragement. "Steady now, bring her down smoothly, you've got this." With trembling hands, Maya guided the plane toward the runway. Sparks still sizzled, smoke curled around the cockpit, but Flight 227 was descending, controlled, alive. The runway grew larger, the city lights fading behind them. The plane touched down with a jolt, tires screeching, metal groaning, but it held. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the cabin, a wave of relief and disbelief. Maya's hands shook violently as she guided the plane to a stop. The engines hummed, then settled. Sparks sputtered, smoke lingered, but Flight 227 had survived. She slumped forward, chest heaving, sweat soaking her clothes, hands numb from exertion. Around her, passengers whispered prayers of thanks, some crying, some hugging loved ones. The off-duty pilot's hand rested on her shoulder, steadying her. His eyes, fierce and proud, met hers. "You did it," he said simply. "You saved them all." Maya closed her eyes, letting the weight of the moment wash over her. She had faced fear, chaos, and near-impossible odds. She had acted when ordinary instinct screamed to hide. She had guided Flight 227 through the storm, through fire, through panic, and survived. And in that moment she realized the terrifying, exhilarating truth. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a survivor, a hero, and the impossible had become reality. The roar of the engines gradually softened, replaced by the steady hiss of air brakes and the faint squeal of tires rolling across the tarmac. Maya Thompson slumped forward in her seat, muscles trembling, sweat pouring down her face, clothes soaked and sticking to her skin. Her hands still clutched the controls, shaking uncontrollably. The cockpit smelled of burnt circuitry and smoke, lingering even as the plane came to a complete stop. Around her, the faint murmur of passengers filled the cabin, a mixture of sobs, whispers of gratitude, and incredulous relief. For a long moment, no one spoke. The chaos that had dominated the last harrowing hour seemed suspended in a quiet, almost unreal stillness. Outside, emergency crews approached cautiously, flashing lights painting the tarmac in urgent reds and blues. Inside, passengers began to unbuckle, slowly emerging from their panic-stricken seats, some hugging the nearest loved one, some staring wide-eyed at the cockpit, struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. The off-duty pilot finally exhaled, leaning back slightly in his seat. His uniform was smudged with soot, sleeves rolled up, tie askew, and yet there was a calm satisfaction in his eyes. He turned to Maya, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said simply, voice quiet but firm. "You saved all of them. Every single life on this plane is here because of you." Maya's knees buckled and she pressed her forehead against the console. Her mind raced, replaying every terrifying jolt, every tilt, every terrifying moment where it seemed Flight 227 might spiral into oblivion. She remembered the screams, the sparks, the smoke curling around her, and the faces of the passengers depending on her. The weight of the past hour crashed over her, leaving her both trembling and hollow. From the cabin, a flight attendant approached, eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. "Maya," she said softly, as though speaking the name aloud would make the nightmare real, "you saved us all. Everyone is alive because of you." Maya barely heard her, still caught between relief and shock. Her hands unclenched slowly, trembling violently as they rested on her lap. She blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of reality. Around her, passengers were beginning to cheer softly, a ripple of astonished applause mingling with tears. Some hugged each other tightly, others knelt in whispered prayers. She realized with a strange detachment that she had become something she never imagined she could be, a hero. The off-duty pilot guided her out of the cockpit. The cabin was still tense, but the air was lighter, filled with quiet relief and awe. Children clung to their parents, some peering toward the front of the plane with wide eyes, as if trying to see the woman who had kept them alive. Elderly passengers whispered words of thanks, some shaking with emotion. The young mother who had been holding her child tightly pressed her hands together, murmuring a prayer of gratitude. Outside, emergency crews began boarding cautiously, ensuring the plane and its passengers were safe. Maya followed the off-duty pilot down the aisle, every step heavy, her body trembling from adrenaline, exhaustion, and the lingering shock of what had transpired. Cameras flashed, and crew members shouted questions and reassurances, their voices a mixture of urgency and awe. Reporters, who had already been alerted to the emergency, began filming, capturing the aftermath of what was being called a near-miraculous survival. Maya stepped onto the tarmac, blinking against the harsh lights. The cold night air bit at her skin, but it also grounded her in reality. She could see the faces of the passengers emerging from the plane, still shaken but alive. Some hugged loved ones, some collapsed in tears of relief, and some turned to her, eyes wide with wonder and gratitude. Every glance, every tear, every whispered thank you hammered home the reality. She had truly saved lives. The off-duty pilot stayed by her side, a quiet anchor in the storm of attention. "You were incredible," he said, voice low but steady. "You stayed calm when everyone else panicked. You followed instructions perfectly. You didn't just survive, you made the impossible happen." Maya's knees buckled again and she lowered herself to the tarmac, overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. Her body shook violently, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She closed her eyes, letting herself finally feel the weight of the moment, the terror, the courage, and the incredible relief of survival. Emergency personnel guided the passengers safely away from the plane, directing them to waiting buses and medical crews. Maya remained seated for a moment longer, staring at Flight 227, the aircraft that had been both her prison and her proving ground. Sparks still faintly smoldered from the overhead compartments, and the faint smell of smoke lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to catastrophe. Then the first reporters approached, microphones extended, cameras flashing. Questions came quickly, overlapping, demanding answers she didn't yet have the words for. How did you stay calm? What was it like in the cockpit? Did you ever think you wouldn't survive? Maya opened her mouth, then closed it, unable to find words that could encompass the terror, the adrenaline, the responsibility, and the sheer impossible nature of what she had just endured. One of the emergency coordinators gently guided her aside, allowing her a moment to breathe. The off-duty pilot stayed nearby, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You'll answer questions soon," he said. "Right now, just breathe. You did more than anyone could ever imagine." Maya inhaled deeply, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs. She realized she had changed. She was no longer the ordinary passenger who had boarded Flight 227 hours ago. She had faced fear, chaos, and near-impossible odds. She had acted when instinct screamed to hide. She had guided a plummeting plane to safety, saved lives, and discovered courage she never knew existed. The passengers began filing into waiting buses and medical tents, some turning back to wave at her, some whispering thanks she could barely hear over the hum of emergency vehicles. She watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion, relief, and awe. Every life she had touched now carried a piece of her courage, a thread connecting them in ways she could not yet understand. Then came the applause, a slow, hesitant clap that grew louder as more passengers emerged. Children waved, some crying, some laughing, and the adults joined in, clapping and cheering, their gratitude filling the night air. Maya felt tears sting her eyes, realizing that she had truly made a difference. The off-duty pilot turned to her, eyes reflecting pride and respect. "You did something most people could never imagine," he said softly. "You turned fear into action. You saved lives, and you did it with courage, grace, and heart. Flight 227 is here because of you." Maya closed her eyes, letting the weight of those words sink in. She had survived terror. She had faced chaos. She had saved lives. And though the memory of the fear would never fully fade, neither would the knowledge that she was capable of extraordinary courage. As the emergency crews guided the last of the passengers to safety, Maya remained on the tarmac for a moment longer, staring at the plane. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance, a reminder of life continuing beyond the nightmare. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool night air fill her lungs, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel pride, relief, and gratitude, not for herself, but for the lives she had helped save. And as she finally stepped away from Flight 227, the world around her seemed impossibly vast, full of possibility, and forever changed by the courage of one ordinary passenger who had faced the impossible and won.